Throughout the entire history of ethics, there's never been a bigger debate than about the passions. Are the passions good? Are the passions evil? Are they somewhere in between? Traditionally, there are two solutions listed as extreme positions to answer this question. First is the position of the Peripatetics, which states that all of the passions are good. And second, the position of the Stoics, which state that the passions are evil. Towering above these opposed extremes is the position of St. Thomas Aquinas, who brought together the insights of each one of these positions, guided by divine revelation, and placed them in a perfect synthesis. Before we get into the synthesis of St. Thomas Aquinas, we need to know a little bit of background material, namely, what are passions? Let's pretend for a second that there's a nice, juicy McChicken sitting in front of you. You direct your attention to this amazing and affordable sandwich, and you feel some sort of internal reaction to sensing this McChicken. You actually feel some sort of desire to eat the sandwich. This internal desire is what we call a passion. You share these passions with the animals since they also are living and have a body. But unlike the animals, you can consider whether to eat the sandwich or not eat the sandwich. And this choice is called an act of the free will. Animals, on the other hand, are drawn by what is called instinct. They do not have an act of the free will. On the other hand, let's consider an intelligent being without a body, that is, an angel. An angel doesn't have passions because passions are physical things that reside in the body, and they don't have bodies to house them. So angels just consider the thing and then choose. So we humans are special in that the sensible goods we pick up on actually affect the choices we make. But is this a good thing? St. Thomas Aquinas provides an answer with quite a few distinctions. First, we must be careful about what we mean by good. By good, we mean a morally good act. A morally good act can only be commissioned by an act of the will. A tree or dog or fish cannot commit a morally good or evil act, since they are not moral agents. In a similar way, if there is a movement of the passions, and the will has not acted in any way, this movement of the passions can't be called a morally evil or morally good action. So in our example above, when someone has a physical reaction to some sort of stimulus, it is not a morally evil or morally good reaction. St. Thomas states that,
since passion is a movement of the sensitive appetite, passion considered in itself cannot be a virtue or a vice, nor anything praiseworthy or blameworthy, because these things belong to reason. However, insofar as the sensitive appetite is in some way subject to reason, in that it can obey reason, the passions themselves can also be praiseworthy or blameworthy, insofar as they can be ordered or restrained.
So now that we have that out of the way, what happens when there is an act of the will attached to these movements of the passions? Here, there's another tricky thing we need to be careful of. In some cases, it is actually obligatory for us to control our passions. Unlike animals, we have a will that can regulate the movements of our passions indirectly. For example, we could engage in acts of mortification, such as fasting, which will help us regulate our bodies better. We could also pray in order to ask for extraordinary help from God. We can build good habits, or we could simply avert our attention so that we are no longer affected by that thing. So in the cases where we are obliged to moderate our passions, such as when they place us in proximate danger of sin, we can be said to sin if we do not regulate them. St. Thomas said,
we may consider the passions of the soul in two ways. First, in themselves. Second, as being subject to the command of the reason and will. If then the passions be considered in themselves, there is no moral good or evil in them. If, however, they be considered as subject to the command of the reason and will, then moral good and evil are in them. They are said to be voluntary, either from being commanded by the will or from not being checked by the will.
But what if there was some sort of act of the will in relation to the passions? St. Thomas distinguishes between, on the one hand, antecedent passions, and on the other hand, consequent passions. In order to illustrate this, let's take the case of 3 murderers. The first murderer walked in on his wife cheating on him, and in the heat of passion killed his wife and the man who was sleeping with his wife. The second murderer was given $10,000 to kill someone, had decided to take it, but wasn't motivated by any strong emotions, but just wanted the money. The third murderer is the case of a woman who found out that her husband was cheating on her. Rather than doing like the first man and doing something in the heat of the moment, she decided to sit back and consider what she was going to do. She decided to slowly poison her husband over a number of months, continuing to consider how much she hates her husband, and using this to keep herself angry enough to carry out the act. Now, each one of these individuals committed a certain moral evil, but these evils are not equal for St. Thomas. In the first act, passion overcame the person and actually made the act less voluntary. So since the act was less voluntary, the person, while still culpable, is less morally culpable than he would have been if he had planned the thing out ahead of time. In the second act, there really isn't any passion involved, and the person just simply considered the circumstances and carried out the killing. In the third act, the passions are actually deliberately nursed in order to make the act of the will even stronger, and to involve the entire person in the action. Therefore, rather than making the act less voluntary, it actually makes it more voluntary, and thus more evil. This is why, in the Western legal tradition, there's a distinction between a crime of passion and a premeditated crime. Both are considered crimes, but one is given a harsher punishment. The latter indicates a stronger act of the will than the former, and thus greater malice on the part of the murderer. In the first act, the passions are called antecedent passions, since they come before an act of the reason and cloud your judgment. And in the third act, the passions are called consequent passions, since they come after an act of the reason, and are actually used by your reason in order to make stronger acts of the will. Thus, St. Thomas states,
The complete account of the praiseworthy and the reprehensible consists in the voluntary. Hence, what detracts from the notion of the voluntary diminishes the notion of the praiseworthy in goodness and the reprehensible in evil.
Now that we've went over how the passions affect bad actions, how do they affect good actions? We can illustrate with 3 good acts to parallel our bad acts from above. For example, we can think of 3 mass-goers. The first mass-goer walks into Mass, and while in Mass, the sound of the music causes a bunch of different passions to arise up in him, and with these, he decides that he is going to walk over to the confessional line and have his confession heard. The second mass-goer walks into Mass and simply considers the fact that going to confession is his religious obligation, and motivated by this consideration, he decides that he is going to walk over to the confessional line and have his confession heard. The third mass-goer, when he walks into Mass, decides to chant a penitential psalm, considering the goodness of God, the pains of hell, and the love of Christ, in order that his entire soul may be ordered towards making as strong acts of repentance as he can induce himself to. In this case, we have the same listing as above. In the first case, the act is the least voluntary, and in the third case, the act is the most voluntary.
The passions of the soul may stand in a twofold relation to the judgment of reason. First, antecedently, and thus, since they obscure the judgment of reason on which the goodness of the moral act depends, they diminish the goodness of the act. For it is more praiseworthy to do a work of charity from the judgment of reason than from the mere passion of pity. In the second place, consequently by way of choice, when to wit, a man by the judgment of his reason chooses to be affected by a passion in order to work more promptly with the cooperation of the sensitive appetite, and thus a passion of the soul increases the goodness of an action.
But this actually leads us to an interesting spiritual application that St. Thomas gives, and which matches the general practice of the Church. In the medieval Church, there was a distinction between how a Mass would be done at a cathedral and how a Mass would be done in a monastic community. Often the cathedral would have much more splendor and sensible beauty attached to the liturgy. On the other hand, the monastic Mass would often be austere and simple. Why is this the case? Well, there had always been a recognition that, while being motivated to do good by antecedent passions is less ideal than being motivated to do good by consequent passions, you are still being motivated to do something that is good. So the Church, in our liturgy, historically adapted the way Mass was done in order to make up for the weakness of the general populace. Many times these sensible goods are necessary for your average person in order to use it as a crutch to make these acts of religion, whereas they would have a much more difficult time if sent to an austere and plain monastic Mass. On the other hand, since the monastics are assumed to be mature, the liturgy gives them the environment to be able to cultivate those consequent passions and make acts that are more voluntary. Thus, St. Thomas says,
It is evident that the human soul is moved in various ways according to various melodies of sound. Hence the use of music in the divine praises is a salutary institution, that the souls of the faint-hearted may be the more incited to devotion. Such like musical instruments move the soul to pleasure rather than create a good disposition within it. In the Old Testament, instruments of this description were employed both because the people were more coarse and carnal, so that they needed to be aroused by such instruments. The soul is distracted from that which is sung by a chant that is employed for the purpose of giving pleasure. But if the singer chant for the sake of devotion, he pays more attention to what he says, both because he lingers more thereon.